Hello, folks. Welcome back to Chris Wyatt Reports. This is Chris, live in central Pennsylvania on this Thursday. Good Lord. Thursday, February 27th, 2025. My special guest today in the Indaba Conversation with Chris is none other than Gabriel Makin from the mother city of Cape Town, although I don't think he's sitting there right now. He's some undisclosed location under brick and steel of a building in Antarctica after releasing the results of this poll. Gabriel, if I'm not mistaken, you work for the Social Research Foundation. You're responsible for the poll that we just saw come out. That's been reported in the press that says ANC support is cratering. Is that accurate? Can you tell us?
Yes, that's accurate. I am the Director of Research at the Social Research Foundation, which is chaired by a guest that you had on very recently, Dr. Franz Cornier.
Indeed. In fact, you reached out to me because I think he said you should get in touch with me to discuss this because I saw that poll and I didn't see at the bottom of the graphic where it was published. It was published in one of the Afrikaans publications that still exists digitally on the News 24 news network. So I saw that and I didn't see at the bottom with Social Research because I questioned it. I said, well, okay, look, lots of people do lots of polls, and unless I know the methodology or the sampling size, especially polls in Africa, I'm a little circumspect. Afrobarometer is well known for doing polls across Africa. So I wanted to talk to you about this. I'm glad you reached out to me. And looking at that, the one thing that struck me as odd, and that's why I want to hear about the methodology, and you can tell us more about it, is I have no difficulty believing whatsoever that if you surveyed the general public of South Africans, black, white, and brown, in all 9 provinces, in the rural areas and urban areas, you're going to find that by and large, the ANC support is cratering, which is what that poll would indicate from last year, 40% of those who voted. And you can answer the methodology in a moment, but I'm guessing this isn't just people who voted, but maybe the population at large. 32% support the ANC. That doesn't surprise me. What was also interesting is that MK looks like they've dropped 3 or 4 points, and the EFF has dropped 3 or 4 points, and even the IFP has dropped a point. But the one outlier that I'm scratching my head about, and maybe it's the date the poll was taken, you had respondents, but the Democratic Alliance gaining 3 points, I think somebody's smoking crack there, Gabriel. You're going to have to tell us what's going on with that one.
Yes, so you've got the numbers completely correct from our poll. I think before I get into what we think of as the explanation for what the numbers are, let's give you a kind of overall view of the survey. So the survey was a sample size of 1,004 registered demographically, geographically representative registered voters. We conduct our surveys telephonically. And at 1,004 voters, we got a margin of error nationally of about 4%, which means that numbers that I give you from the poll can vary 4% up or 4% down. So yes, the ANC, MK, EFF, all down. The only, as you point out, outlier that's up is the DA, except for the fact that for the first time ever, we haven't really had this in a poll. We've got 15% of voters who are likely voters, which means that according to the way that we model voting behavior, they will vote in the next election, who said that they are undecided, what we're calling free agents in the South African political system. And so the DA moving up by a few points shouldn't really be as shocking as the fact that 15% of the electorate have decided to check out. And they haven't checked out and just answered, I don't know, to the question, if there were a national general election held today, who would you vote for? Because that's not how we do that's not the only question we do allocation of votes on. We do allocation of votes based on leadership favorability, party favorability, and then performance indicators of parties if, for example, it's a big 3 or 4 party, because we have some performance indicators for them. And what it means that when 15% of the population is actually undecided, registered voters are undecided, it means that they do not feel warmly at all to any party. And when they say that when they're asked, who are you going to vote for? They don't know. And they actually don't know because there's no one in the South African political scene who's appealing to them. So then we have the DA and the DA's rise, because it makes sense given that, the MK party is in somewhat of a disarray. There's infighting within the EFF, that their voters might move from them to being unsure about where they're going to vote. And then in terms of the ANC, as you pointed out, there's been no reason for any ordinary South African, who we feel are much more perceptive than the media classes at knowing what's going on in their country. But there's been no reason for ANC voters to feel as if the ANC is moving in any sort of a positive direction. And so they have also decided to drop out and kind of sit and wait and watch what's going to happen. And because it's 2025, it's a non-election year, this all makes sense because they have the time to sit and wait and watch. They don't have any pressure on them to make a decision, so they can afford to be somewhat circumspect. When it comes to the DA voters, what I think is very interesting, and it's a phenomenon we picked up when we did our first poll way back in 2022, which is that the DA is the party that has the strongest brand image. What do I mean by that? I mean that when we do a word association game of which word describes which party's best or which phrase, we find that the DA is associated with was associated with the phrases has good leadership, provides accountability, has good policies. The ANC as a brand was associated with anti-poor, makes broken promises, and only cares about themselves. And so cut forward now to the GNU. These are two kind of brands coming together and forming a government. Voters have realized, and we tested this because we asked them, do you think that the ANC dominates the GNU, essentially? And about 50% of all voters and 62% of DA voters say, yes, the ANC does dominate the policy agenda of the GNU. So voters have perceived that the ANC is in charge, but voters did not associate the ANC's policy agenda with anything good. And so as the ANC kind of support has fallen away because it's pursuing an already unpopular policy agenda, the DA is kind of seen maybe as the island in the storm that people think is really just being kind of left to the side, and if only they were given the chance to implement their policies, maybe things might move in the right direction. Whereas you and I might perceive that as kind of political weakness on behalf of the DA, voters perceive it as the ANC just being overpowering and aggressive and not giving the DA space to implement its better policies.
Well, Gabriel, I won't claim that my audience is a representative sample size of South African politics, but I can tell you that my representative sample from my audience is very angry at the Democratic Alliance, and I found it shocking to see that. Now, it's good to hear that. So it's registered likely voters. That's what we're talking. That's your sample size. So not general society. That I think that's probably difficult to do a poll on that, but that would be interesting too. But I mean, people are really angry here. I mean, and it's consistent. It's new people coming in this program all the time, calling John Steenhuisen all kinds of names and calling the DA World Economic Forum stooges and about Helen Zillen, the Soros Foundation, and a lot of people. Look, I know it's not representative. It's like when I ask questions, who will take Trump up on his refugee offer? I'm getting 67 to 85% of my respondents, and we're talking about 2,000 and 3,000 people answer some of these polls. I'm going. Well, yeah, okay, that's you guys, great, and I appreciate watching my program, but it's not the rest of the country. But still, it's hard to fathom, given the DA's response to Bella. That made a lot of people very angry, particularly DA supporters. Its non-statement on the black tax, the 3% corporate tax that Parks Tao is proposing. Its weak response to expropriation like compensation, and they can argue all day that they've had a response, but it's unacceptable. They didn't lead a challenge to this that could have gone to the Constitutional Court within 30 days, just getting 1/3 of the members of Parliament. The DA said nothing about it. And then they came out with their press conference in the light of what was going on here after EWC was signed. And the only thing they said about it is that, well, our feelings are hurt because we found out through WhatsApp, John Steenhuisen, no one told us. And instead, like, oh, the blue machine, we will be the biggest vote getters. Man, come on. So that's why I think a lot of my audience is scratching their head. I don't doubt your poll now that I've heard that, the numbers, the sample size, who you're dealing with. It's probably realistic, but still it seems counterintuitive is my point that the DA would be surging. And that's when was this poll conducted? That might be a fair question.
So the poll was conducted from the 3rd of February to the 17th of February. So it was actually during the kind of big backlash towards expropriation. And I think what the poll is showing at the moment, and because I don't think it should be read as a kind of DA surge in support, because, with a 4% margin of error, 25% and 22% are essentially the same number. And so the DA actually really hasn't grown from its position in the election. What is happening at the moment is that the ANC is the one who's dominating the narrative. They are setting the agenda. But that means that they are also being associated far more deeply with the policies that they're pushing forward than the DA. And although the DA's response is weak and it could be pushing back far more, the fact that the ANC seem to hold the reins and control the direction of the ship is what is protecting the DA's kind of vote share at the moment, because on things like expropriation, which we know is historically with the data that, well, basically every survey we've asked about it is an incredibly unpopular policy. And in fact, all of the ANC's most populist policies we find are incredibly unpopular. So you mentioned a few of them there. We found that amongst ANC voters, and this is also incredibly counterintuitive, some of the issues of merit-based appointment in the civil service is an 80-20 issue amongst ANC voters in favor of merit against race-based appointments. When it comes to race-based procurement, it's about a 75-25 split. In expropriation, we asked in this latest survey, we asked 3 questions on expropriation. Do you think it's a good economic idea? 60% of ANC voters said no. Mm-hmm. Do you trust the government to expropriate property? 60% of ANC voters said no. And will expropriation without compensation drive foreign investors away? 60% of ANC voters said yes. And so even the voter base in the party is set against the more populist overreaches in policy. And so the fact that the ANC gave yet another kind of false time horizon of reform, because that's essentially what the GNU is being viewed as, I think, to a large degree for ANC supporters, where they declared, before it had been CR17, then it was CR19, the New Dawn, the New Hope. And now we've had the GNU, a new dawn. We're bringing the coalition. We've gone to 40%. We've found ourselves. We're humble. We're bringing in these partners who are going to help us to chart a new direction. It's just another instance of a broken promise by the ANC and a move in the more populist directions, which puts the ANC far past its voter base in terms of what the voter base wants. And so that's why they are receiving the brunt of the damage, because they're the ones who are perceived as people in charge of the direction.
Well, Gabriel, look, it's not counterintuitive to me at all. Look, I mean, my research, I don't have polling data. I can refer to polling data, but my research is done anecdotally, which is not the best source, but it's done on the ground, and it's done by communicating with people in different sectors and different segments of society. And, I guess I'll crow a little bit here, but I famously predicted the ANC would come in at 38 to 42%, not in April of 2024, but in November of 2021. And I stuck to that prediction, and a lot of people told me I was crazy. I know nothing about South African politics. And I said, well, I know a little bit more than you think I know. And there's a reason why I've come up with that figure, looking at what happened across the country in the municipal elections, using it as a template for what was likely to happen. Now, the truth changed a bit, but it changed the direction where it was a wash. It didn't push my number either way, and they came in at 40% of those who bothered to vote. But what you're saying here, that's not counterintuitive to me. My experience with black, white, and brown South Africans is that they like merit-based stuff. They don't like patronage unless they're a beneficiary of it. And so few people are beneficiaries of patronage that people don't, by and large, want it. And so the things you said to me aren't counterintuitive. Maybe to the glitterati who believe News 24 and IOL and Daily Maverick and ENCA and all of those people that are pushing their own narratives, instead of journalism. Excuse me. But maybe that's counterintuitive to them. It's not counterintuitive to me. I can just picture a certain broadcaster, television announcer on one of the networks, saying, but Gabriel, I can't believe that black South Africans would be opposed to the ANC appointments. I could see that coming out of them. But I think that to me, it's not counterintuitive at all. And it's refreshing to hear that. It jives with what I've experienced anecdotally and what I've done in talking to people, is that South Africans, they don't want this nonsense. The positions that the ANC is pushing are contrary to the benefit of South Africans, and I think most South Africans realize that. It sounds like your polling would bear that out.
It bears that out exactly. If you'll indulge me, I'll just give you a kind of list of the questions that we asked on policy positions that you get the majority, these kind of this almost 2/3 split in favor and 1/3 split against. So, on the question of lowering taxes, South Africans are in favor of lowering taxes to create a more business-friendly environment rather than the government raising taxes to provide better service delivery. We talked about being anti-BEE in appointment and procurement. When it comes to school choice, the Bella Bill, that's another one that splits about 60-40. There's slightly more favor towards a kind of centralized education, but really not that much more. And still, the majority of South Africans would prefer school choice, the ability to choose between private schools, public schools. When we asked questions about whether businesses should be able to operate if they just pay taxes and employ people, if they're non-BEE compliant, that's a 70-30 issue where 70% of people say, yes, of course, businesses should be able to operate if they aren't BEE compliant. As long as they pay taxes and employ people, it's fine. Then the last thing is national health insurance. And this has been a difficult one for us to nail down exactly, because one of the interesting things about polling is that sometimes, well, a lot of the times, the way you put the question can create kind of differences in how people perceive what you're actually asking. And so we've done NHI in a bunch of different ways, and it generally splits about 55-45 in favor of the idea of nationalization. But then when you put it in such a way as you make it sound like the government is going to be in charge of all hospitals, or you get to keep private medical aids around, then that reverses and the majority go against it. And so even on their most popular populist policy, when people are asked, okay, so, they're in favor of the idea of the policy, but when they're asked, do you kind of want the government to be implementing it? Then they go, no, we don't trust the government to be able to implement a policy like this. And so every single time we've polled, and this is across, in 2022, we had a single poll. 2023, we polled about 5 times. 2024, we were polling near constantly in the lead up to the election. And then we've produced another poll afterwards. And then this year is our first poll. Across all of these different polls, we've found on every policy question, the ANC, its more populist agenda is set against about 2/3 of the country. And so what your anecdotal evidence bears out is the exact truth, which is that the average South African understands that the populist agenda of the ANC goes against the improvement of their material circumstances. It's not working in their favor, and they are angry and upset and don't want it.
Well, that does make sense to me. But the thing about the national health insurance is that it's fraught with all kinds of problems, because you just alluded to it, the way you asked the question. If I were to ask South Africans, do you think everyone should have access to adequate, reasonably affordable health care on need when you need it? I think it'd probably be universal. People say, yeah, everyone should have access to health care. But then, who pays for it? And what does it mean if it's taken over by the government? And I think the problem in South Africa is there's been so much propaganda, particularly from the media, about what NHI means. And people don't realize, those who understand economics realize this, just how devastating this will be for South Africa. We've tried this nonsense in America. So America doesn't have a healthcare system. That's a myth. We have a variety of providers, private providers or for profit. We have religious hospitals, Lutheran hospitals. We have Shriners, which is a hospital for children started by Danny Thomas and others. It takes care of children with unusual issues. And then we also have the Veterans Administration. We have military hospitals. We have state-run hospitals, each of the states. We have municipal-run. We have everything under the sun. There's no integrated system. There's been an effort to try that, but it's just so diverse, so comprehensive. And what we had was Barack Obama with the Unaffordable Care Act, which is what I call it, the Unaffordable Care Act. And all that did was jerry-rig and pervert the payment system. And it shifted the burden to the taxpayer, and it disenrolled 20 million people who had gotten their health coverage, their medical aid, through their employer, because it wound up raising the prices of insurance, because people with pre-existing conditions couldn't be rejected by insurance companies. So they had to bear the cost of someone walk in who's, paraplegic and now costing them $3 million a year in bills. Now they've got to pay for that because they can't refuse them. So they push the cost to everyone else, and employers couldn't afford that. So they dropped the insurance, which pushed the people onto the state rolls, which provided less coverage, less selection, less care. So this whole thing gets perverted all the time because those who don't understand economics don't realize there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to paying for medical care. What I find fascinating, Gabriel, and I don't know if you've asked this question in South Africa, is that I find it offensive as a human being that people consider healthcare to be a human right. It's not a human right. I mean, we don't pop out of the womb with a gynecologist, and a pediatrician and a dentist, and a podiatrist waiting to take care of our needs. Those people go for extensive education, internships to learn their skills, to learn their craft. They build a practice, they build an experience, they become good, hopefully good at what they're doing. And this are all things that human beings create. It's like bridges. Just because the Orange River's there doesn't mean you're allowed to cross it. Good luck swimming across it, okay? But if somebody builds a bridge, that's not an entitlement. That was built by people. It's something that was created. So I always find it quite offensive that people think that healthcare is a human right. I don't think it is. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, these are natural human rights. Anyway, but I guess I'm an outlier when it comes to that these days. But the world is turning more in my favor, I think. So on this issue of NHI, do you find that it's difficult to frame the questions in a way? Because I can see where a poll could be very skewed from the person seeing the results go, wait a second, the way they ask that question. So, I mean, is that a continuing concern for you with the NHI?
It's a continuing concern with us in terms of every kind of policy question. As it's our responsibility as a polling group to make sure that what we are doing is getting at the heart of the matter, and that we aren't trying to kind of pervert anyone's view of the question. So we, in the lead up to this poll, as a kind of maybe bit of insider baseball that no one else has heard about, we had very fierce discussions in building the script about how we should be asking questions around expropriation, questions around John Steenhuisen and the DA's leadership, and questions around the kind of policy agenda of the GNU. Because we did want to ascertain, do people hold the view of your kind of general audience that John Steenhuisen and the DA under his leadership are not moving in the right direction, they're kind of being bullied by the ANC. But the problem is that if I ask a question like that and I use maybe John Steenhuisen's name or I use the DA's name, then I can lead people to just answering based on how they feel about the DA or John Steenhuisen. You don't really get a clear answer on exactly what it is you're trying to test.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you for a second. Yeah, what you get is a Times Live daily poll. That's what you get, with questions that are leading questions to get the answer they want. So they go, see, this is what people think. That's what you wind up with, correct?
That is exactly what you wind up with. And so it's always about trying to tone down, use neutral language, not try to give anyone a kind of any reason to think that we're trying to catch them out or whatever, and try and get at what the heart of the matter is, which is why, for example, we didn't just ask the one question about expropriation. We asked it from 3 different angles, and because the data essentially split the exact same way every time, we can say something substantive about it. This is all kind of important lead-in to your question around NHI, which is, yes, it's very, very difficult, especially on the issue of healthcare, for the reasons you've already outlined, that to get an actual accurate sample of what people think. And so that's why we have to rely on the fact that generally, when put in a way that involves the government or the kind of governance of NHI and what will actually happen, when questions are put in that way, people are far more skeptical of it than a kind of broad view of the policy, because generally people are in favor of, as you pointed out, free access to healthcare when you need it, if you need it. And so there is getting to the heart of these matters is difficult, which is also why we poll so often and try to repeat questions or ask questions in slightly different ways on policy issues to figure out, are we actually seeing something real here?
Yeah, no, I think that's a real challenge here. I feel for pollsters. In America, they've taken quite a beating politically over the past few election cycles. But that's here, it's been pretty obvious that many of the polls, the sampling is done they don't make good adjustments because polling is biased because of what's happened in America. People feeling uncomfortable answering pollsters accurately and honestly. And we've seen the Trump factor in each election he's run. In 3 elections now, we've seen Donald Trump polling 3 to 5% lower in most polls than he actually gets at the polling station. And so this last poll, last time around, some of these pollsters factored that in, and they had more accurate outcomes. I've always factored in, and I'm not doing a poll, but I look at the poll numbers, and I'm looking and look at the data where it's coming from, and I've always figured that there's a Trump factor, even 2016. I figured it but as in 2016, Gabriel, in America, I would talk to people and they're like, I'm voting for Trump, but I said, you don't sound very enthusiastic. Well, I don't tell anybody about it, man, because that guy's a jackass. I don't want everything. I don't want, my family, So you got that factor, and that carried over through 3 elections for him. So, I mean, I suppose you get that sort of thing too. But, I mean, polling must be really challenging because the way you have to structure the questions so that you're not accused of being biased, you're trying to be as objective as possible. I imagine that's probably a big part of what you do, trying to craft these questions when you write polls.
Exactly. I mean, that's a large part, but it's interesting you bring up the US because, as you said, there were some polls that did actually adjust for the Trump factor and did get much closer to the actual results. And we at the SRF, we were following that poll and the polls quite closely, and we made a call that Trump would win. Unfortunately, we didn't realize that it wasn't going to be as close as even the best polls were saying.
I did. But I called the vote difference, and I called the percentage almost exactly right. Now, to be fair, in 2020, I also said Trump was going to win, and apparently he did win. That's what we're told. Anyway.
But when it comes to South Africa, I think that South Africa actually, at the moment, has a couple of very important advantages as a pollster to make sure that our polls are very accurate. And just as a measure of accuracy, our polls are all public. You can find us on srfreports.co.za. But just go and look at our election poll, where I think, apart from the MK party, every single party's result on our 58% turnout was, on the last day of polling, was within the margin of error of what they finally got. And so that meant that, and the margin of error of that was about 1.7%. So we got everything within 1.7%. And why could we do that? Well, because South Africa's voting system is actually very helpful for polling, because we've got a pure PR system, so pure proportional representation, which means the percentage of the popular vote you get equals directly the percentage of the seats in parliament you get. And so when we find that the ANC is on 40% nationally, we know that the ANC will get 40% of the seats in parliament. We don't have to adjust in the ways that you have to do in the states, where you actually have to look state by state, who is going to win this election in the state, and then who is going to therefore win the electoral college overall. Then the second important factor that South African polling has working in its favor is that South Africa has very, very deep cell phone penetration, but it's a very new phenomenon. And so when you're called out of the blue by a random number, the likelihood that someone's going to pick your call up as a pollster is much higher in South Africa than it is in America. I think in America, most polling operations have a success rate of about 1 in 10. So 1 in 10 calls will get picked up, answered, and then they will agree to answer the question. When we do it, it's about 1 in 3. And so people generally aren't as skeptical when we come calling, and they're much more willing to answer our questions, which means it's much easier to create a representative sample, because we're not being rejected outright by, all different types of people. So that means that we actually have a strong advantage in putting these polls together, and we get very, very close to the quick of what South Africans are feeling.
No, that's a great point. Those are real advantages, and I can attest to that. My phone sits on silent. Whoops, you can't see it there. It sits on silent 24/7 because I can't be bothered with the constant barrage of things. I've been receiving 3 political phone calls per day while I'm broadcasting because they're trying to poll me, and I've just ignored it. And I have voted in every single election since I turned 18 years of age a couple days ago. No, but it's been a while. But every single election, even when I've been deployed in combat in Africa, I've voted every time. I've never missed an election. I vote every time. The exception has been in primaries when I wasn't a member of a registered party. You can't vote in primaries, so just in the general election. But yeah. So and I rarely answer these polls because it's. But you're right. It's a really low response rate here in the States, and that has an effect of skewing polls as well, because you're not being able to get the pick of the litter that you're looking for to get a good sample. So now, what other polling do you guys do? Do you do a lot of social issues? Do you look at other things? Because I got all kinds of questions. I got some ideas for polls for you.
Well, so we've tried to tailor our polls always to the time and place in which we'll find them. So, a lot of our kind of work is reading the bones and trying to divine what it is are going to be the hot button political issues in the 2 to 3 weeks that our poll will be in the field. One of the things that was quite exciting was when we were doing this poll, for example, is we asked questions as a brief side thing. We asked 2 questions about the American response to South Africa. We asked, would America be justified in introducing targeted sanctions against corrupt leaders and people who work against the national security interests? And about that splits about 50-50. And when you break it down by demographics, there are some key splits, but it's a divisive question. Then we also asked, would America be justified in cutting off healthcare funding because it's their money and we should have to pay for our healthcare? And then 60% of voters said we would be in favor of America cutting off funding, which is quite funny given that this is what's happened just a week after our poll came out of the field.
Well, I mean, it did really happen. That was misreported, but today it has happened. Today It stopped. As of today, a couple hours ago, President Trump, letters are delivered. PEPFAR is done and dusted, finished and clar, at least for the now. There's no more money coming. So, yeah, that is the case right now.
Yes, and so when, for example, we were polling in 2023, at the beginning of 2023, our poll was a focus on 2 things, which was the electricity situation, kind of who do you blame for load shedding? What do you blame for load shedding? How do you think we should get out of it? All these types of things, support for coal, nuclear, gas, solar and wind. And we also did some work on people's participation in protests and people's participation in violent protests. Forward a few months, we went into the Western Cape and we tested the sentiments all around the DA and Western Cape independence there. Then we went to KZN and we looked at Jacob Zuma as the primary issue in KZN. Then we went and did a kind of general survey in October of 2023, but the focus there was, okay, there's going to be a coalition government. Let's try and figure out who people want in the coalition, what are the policy agenda should be for the coalition, and what are people's feelings towards coalitions like at the moment. Then we went into the Western Cape in the beginning of 2024 to figure out, the Western Cape has a different demographic makeup to the rest of South Africa. It's about 50% colored, 30% black, 15% white, and then so what was the hot button issue there for us was October 7th and the kind of perception amongst colored South Africans who primarily reside in the Western Cape towards the Israel-Hamas war. Then we did another survey to figure out what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal, because we found when we polled in September of 2023 that Jacob Zuma was the most popular figure in KZN by a large mile. And how is this? We asked the question, this is one of my favorite questions we've ever asked because of the result we got. We asked the question, who has been the best president for KwaZulu-Natal? And amongst the general sample of voters in KwaZulu-Natal, it was number 1, Nelson Mandela, and number 2, Jacob Zuma. Amongst black voters, Nelson Mandela and Jacob Zuma were tied as the best president for KwaZulu-Natal in their perception. And so we already at that point knew that if Jacob Zuma did anything, KZN was going to change. Then we went back into KZN, found out what was happening, got to see that MK was a real phenomenon. And then afterwards, we began 6 weeks out from the last election. We did a daily tracking poll in which we would poll with supersized samples in Gauteng, KZN, and the Western Cape. We'd poll 300 new people a day. And it started with an initial base sample of about 1,800 people. We'd add the 300 people for the first 2 days to get a total sample now of 2,400. And then every day onwards, we would add the 300 newest and take out the 300 oldest, which would therefore give us a rolling average, which was one of the most insightful pieces of research I've ever done, as you could watch in real time the effect of, for example, Ramaphosa signing in to law the NHI, where we literally saw for 2 weeks up until that point, every day the ANC had improved 0.5%, 0.5%, and then hit NHI and starts coming down. And so we've done, always the focus of the polls is what are going to be the political movers and what are people's perceptions of what's happening in politics.
No, that's fascinating, and I'm not at all surprised by that. No, look, I'm all about, not just crowing when I get it right, but I do get things wrong. We all get things wrong. I did expect and predict that MK would be the biggest vote getter in KZN, but I figured they'd come in around 30, 32%, not 45, 46%. But to be fair, I thought that the EFF would do poorly. They were claiming they're going to win KZN. They were obviously smoking crack cocaine, but the EFF is almost gone in KZN. They were eaten alive. They were destroyed worse than the ANC was destroyed by MK in the province, which a lot of people this day still haven't realized that. EFF almost has no presence in KZN. The IFP did slightly better, which gave them some municipalities it wouldn't have had otherwise. The DA actually did better in KZN, but barely. But I mean, the real issue here in the phenomenon was MK. But it goes to the point of, I've said a cult of personality. It's a personality. It's Zuma's personality. If Zuma wasn't there, it wouldn't be like this. And that party's kind of falling apart right now, which is not a surprise. But, my question about polling is because I would be fascinated to see, especially on a rolling, daily average, to see where this stuff comes out. I'm curious to see what likely voters have to say about the current situation between the United States and South Africa. Do they blame Donald Trump for, canceling foreign aid? Are they blaming Trump for the escalating tensions, or do they blame the ANC and Cyril Ramaphosa? I mean, it's not Trump who goes and gives our State of the Union address and says we won't be bullied by South Africa. It's Cyril Ramaphosa that says that, and it's not our foreign minister who goes in Deutsche Welle and says, well, your government's policies are racist, because it's the ANC doing that. So I'm curious about the perceptions. It sounds like South African voters are a lot brighter than the media give them credit for.
Oh, for sure. It's been one of the most inspiring takeaways as a young South African. I left just a kind of moment of personal history. I left the country to go study in the Netherlands, and when I left South Africa, I was like, I'm done. I'm not coming back. I feel I don't feel wanted. I don't feel like my talents are going to be used. I go to university. I realize, thanks to Jordan Peterson and kind of his influence, that actually the problems that drive me are South African problems. And if the South African problems drive me, I need to go and do something about them. And so I decided after I was done and taken a gap year, I'm going to move back. Didn't know what to do. I started a podcast, talking to some people. Luckily, along the way, met Frans Cronje, and then I found myself in the Social Research Foundation and able to contribute meaningfully to the South African political discussion and the body of knowledge in South Africa. And why I've been able and so inspired and what my position has given me is, every time we do these polls, we always we're pessimistic, because when you're following the day-to-day political game, you get the sense that every time the ANC is just outmaneuvering everyone, and that the country will inevitably always, political game will inevitably always be won by the ANC. But what happens is that when the ANC engages in these political games, they suffer. And they suffer in terms of the vote share that they're getting. And every time we saw this. And so, we saw In 2022, they were sitting at around 50%. By the time we were done with 2023, they dropped to 45%. But we had known for a while that there's a significant chunk of ANC voters, given, the associations they had of the party, given the fact that the policy direction and the policies that the party were pursuing went against what they wanted, that there was a significant chunk who were just waiting for something to break away. And then MK Party happens, and then that chunk breaks away. And then, we have the GNU, and the GNU looked as if it might be a moment where the ANC might consider some sort of reform and might start to move in the direction that its voters want. And then we see 100 days in, when we polled the GNU, we found that the ANC had actually moved up to 45%. The DA had also moved up to about 24%, and MK, EFF, and everyone else was kind of stable. So in that first 100 days, the ANC had been rewarded because there was still the new car smell. Everyone was still really optimistic, and they hadn't given enough evidence as to what the direction of the GNU would actually be. Cut forward now to our latest poll, and we see that although, as you point out, the glitterati, they're talking about, they have tried to convince voters that attacks on their property rights are not attacks on their property rights, that that the ANC, who they criticize for their corruption, they criticize for basically only their corruption, is actually a party that has somehow magically reformed, and that we should allow it to control the policy agenda. Voters see this and they are sickened by it, because it's the same thing they were seeing in the previous government, and they had rejected that because the ANC lost 17% of its vote share. It's a historic loss. And so the fact that the ANC had been repudiated in such a way and then continued grates for the voters, and then the voters decide, okay, well, we're done. We're not voting for you. And so you see the ANC now at 32%.
But you can see why a lot of people are skeptical, not of your polls, but of politics in general, because the politicians just lie. I mean, the ANC, as you said, there was a honeymoon. But to be fair, I mean, Gabriel, to be fair, new cars do smell quite nice. So I understand why the polls came out the way. But I wish that I miss that new car smell. I haven't had a new car in a decade. But a lot of people are skeptical because the results. Okay, this is quickly the results. A couple parties, the ANC, we won this election, dude. You shed 2 million voters, and by the way, only you say 58% of the population, but that's 58% of people who bothered to register to vote. That's only 31% of the eligible, or 38% of the eligible population. What about the rest of the 42 million people who didn't bother to register, who've given up, who aren't even participating? And people say, well, they don't vote. Well, they voted in 1994. Yeah, they all voted in 94, so you can get those people to vote, but they're not voting for a reason. So people are skeptical. I mean, I can understand why they're that way. But, going forward here, what are you guys focused on in the short term? And what kind of polling are you looking at right now? Is there a poll you're working on that might be of interest? Is that a state secret? Can you share that with us?
No, I can. The next poll we're working on is actually the poll that has excited me the most, because I have no idea what we're going to find. So this is going to be a little bit of a different poll than our normal ones. We will still probably include some hot button political issues, but we're going to call this new poll the South African Values Survey. And it's going to be an attempt to create a kind of political compass of South Africans' values. So where are the underlying beliefs in South Africa, and what are the underlying beliefs that undergird politics in the country? And so that should give us, and hopefully will give us, the ability to definitively demonstrate that, on even the most kind of value-driven level, that where people lie. And I have no idea what we're going to find, but I'm very optimistic, because thus far, when it comes to the views of the South African public, the main finding has always been that they are moderate and pragmatic, and they understand what's going on. And so I'm very, very excited to see exactly what the values that they hold really are.
No, I think that's exciting. And actually, the values gives me a chance to bring something up here. It is my program, so I'm going to be a little cheeky with you here, Gabriel, okay? Listen, look, I'm still at heart a 20-something, 30-something. I'm still a guy that's Inspector Gadget, testing technology, out in the forefront of social media, all that stuff. I mean, for someone that's my age, that's kind of unusual, and so I feel like I'm a 20-something, 30-something at heart. But I got to tell you, your generation and this gap year nonsense, I mean, damn it, we just went to work. You went to this gap year. You guys are spoiled, man. Who gets a gap year to go and screw off and go backpacking in Europe and find yourself in the Himalayas? Get your bum to work. What is this gap year stuff? Come on, man. Tell me what this gap year thing is. I don't understand it. Get off my lawn.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't go backpacking anywhere. I had a very boring gap year. I worked as a barista in a coffee shop in The Hague.
Okay. You're forgiven. You're forgiven. You worked. Okay, that's what I'm looking for here. It's about working, earning your way. Get off my lawn.
Exactly. I was one of the top 2 coffee producers in The Hague by the time I was done with my gap year, so I felt very proud of myself.
But on a more serious note, we got to have a light moment here and there. But on a more serious note, who are your consumers? I mean, do you have a constituency that these polls are done for, or are they just done for public release? I mean, because I see some of these show up in the newspapers, of course, because they're consumers. But do you have a direct consumer base that does this? Do you have followers? Do you have supporters that send funds to the website or something like that? I'm not really sure how it works. Because the polls are interesting. Obviously, they're of interest and value. So, who are the people that are interested in them?
So when the Social Research Foundation was originally started, the first poll was kind of produced with the idea being that we would focus in on delivering it to key policymakers, journalists, and business people, because it's high value information. And then France received the poll results and was so stunned by what he found that he thought, no, we can't keep this a secret. There's no point in doing that. It has to be public. And so the decision was taken that from going forward, we would contact business people, policymakers, decision makers, and journalists and tell them, we've got this poll in the field, and then give them the results and show them directly. But also, we have to have the website and make it publicly accessible, so whoever wants to access the data can freely access the data. Because I think when you start to get a grip on it as a kind of political observer, you can really understand, what are the driving factors in South Africa and what are motivating people. And it's been such a privilege to be able to work in this field and do the research that I'm doing. And so the fact that for an example, in the lead up to the election, you ask who the consumer is. I think we had something like 49,000 daily users of our website in the last 3 weeks to the lead up to the election. So that could be whoever. We don't know, but there was a significant group of people who are interested. And then you take that and you compound it by the fact that we get releases in the media and in South African and international media more broadly. And then sometimes I get to have the great honor of coming on Colonel Wyatt's show. And we just want as wide an audience as possible to have access to the data, because I think once you start to see these numbers, it should really change the way you think about the country, and it should make you a lot more optimistic about the quality of the individuals who make up South Africa. And I've always had that sense about South Africans, but now I have incontrovertible evidence because of the poll work we're doing.
Well, look, I can't disagree with that at all, because that's my personal experience with South Africans. They are a lot brighter than people make them out to be. Even those who've not had the good fortune to have a decent education are not stupid the way that the media makes them out to be. And so much that's wrong in South Africa is from politicians and the media. They're the ones that push this narrative nonsense. Look, I mean, if you looked at South Africa from the outside and paid attention to what's going on, you'd think there are race wars, that people are murdering each other based on skin color. Same thing people thought about America. Oh, it's not safe to go there. Black people, Black Lives Matter. That was isolated nonsense. And there was there was a lot of places when it happened, but that's not the nature of the country, and it's also not the nature of South Africans. And it really irritates me to no end that the press gets away with this. I mean, we see it all the time. And it's not just the press; it's also institutions. The South African Human Rights Commission is very selective in the case it goes after. They go after Ronaldo Khos for a 15-year-old video in which he made an academic point, and because it offends people's sensibilities. But meanwhile, Nota Bole can call me a subhuman and a less than human being than him because I have Neanderthal DNA, and apparently I'm a dog, and our women can't bear children, and apparently that's okay. That doesn't offend the dignity. But that's not South Africa. That is an institution. Those are politicians. Those are media outlets. The media doesn't get attention unless they make things clickbaitable. I'll give you an example. So the other day, a number of journalists were given information that AfriForum and Solidarity were here. The media in South Africa didn't know that because every time they tell the media, they undermine them by running stories and making claims about them. So I ran a story, and it was only 11 hours later when ENCA finally ran a news story about what I ran about. I said, hey, good job catching up with the news, guys. I broke this story 11 hours ago. But I mean, my point is what we see, the face of it is not South Africa. It sounds like your polling is finding the true South Africa, and it gives you hope that the country's in better shape or can be in better shape than the politicians make it out to be.
Exactly, and talking about the true South Africa, I think I'll leave maybe a final point that I'd like to make from our latest poll, three numbers actually, that are incredibly interesting. So we asked two questions regarding Cyril Ramaphosa. We phrased it. The first one: would you support a DA-led motion of no confidence in Cyril Ramaphosa? And that breaks about 50-50. But when it comes to DA support, about 67% are in favor of a motion of no confidence in President Ramaphosa. And the only real significant constituency who are set against it, of course, are the ANC. Then we asked another question, which is, because of the performance of the ANC dropping from 57% to 40%, Cyril Ramaphosa should have resigned as president. When you put it like that, now 60% of all South Africans are in favor and say that he should resign. And then we did this last little thing as just a kind of fun experiment, which is, so imagine if there was a successful motion of no confidence brought by the DA in Cyril Ramaphosa, and there was an election that resulted afterwards. Who would you vote for under those conditions? And so now the thinking is, okay, everyone else is the same. The only difference is that the ANC is led by someone who's not President Ramaphosa. And under those conditions, the ANC drops to 21%, the DA moves to 28%, MK moves up to about 15%, the EFF moves up to about 9%, but now we've got 20% of the voters who are undecided. So under those conditions, everything is up in the air. And so I find a result like that incredibly exciting because it means that, there's literally everything to play for still.
Well, Gabriel, two things excite me, and one I've been excited about for years, and I've tried to encourage. Look, I spent a lot of time in 2021 trying to encourage South Africans to get off their bums and go vote, and it was a 31% turnout. And the reason I did that is I said, in South Africa, your governance is different than here in America. My rubbish was picked up yesterday by a private company whom I pay. They were on time. They picked my rubbish up. They picked up my recycling. Excuse me just a moment. Oh, where's it at? This stupid watch. I can't turn off the alarm. I dug it out of the basement. It's been running for 9 years. Anyway, but it's my G-Shock. I haven't worn it in so long, a wristwatch. I forgot how the damn thing works. Anyway, but I try to encourage people to go vote because in South Africa, my rubbish gets picked up private company. My water is delivered by a co-op that we're part of here that we sign up for. And then my electricity is done by a private corporation. These are services in South Africa that the government provides in one way or another. And where you see it most directly is those services, not the foreign policy, not the Congo. And you see that, but that doesn't affect you on a day-to-day basis, most people. But if you have no lights, if you have potholes, if you have no rubbish pickup, if the cops don't respond, you get angry. And if you want to fix that, you can fix that, maybe not so much the cops, but the rest of it at the municipal level. So I said that the opposition parties need to convince the voters, because a lot of people are like, oh, black South Africans will never vote against the ANC. Well, that's actually not true, folks. Pay attention to what's going on. But the way you prove that you can deliver a better result is you get into office at municipal level, and you need an outright majority. Try to avoid a coalition if possible. Get in, govern honestly, be transparent with the public, and people go, wow, hey, look at this. Look at this here in in Clarence, this Freedom Front Plus party has actually run this city pretty well. Maybe we should vote for them. Or, you know, in Canaland, instead of Jeffrey Donson, or the Donson guy, that convicted pedophile rapist, instead of him, maybe another party is running there. And then look at that, they're running it. Things are going well. But South Africans didn't vote, 31%. They didn't listen to me. So anyway, it's just a little frustrating to see that people don't get out and vote. So what I'm saying I was excited about is that the 15% that you found in your recent poll that are like, oh, I don't know who I'm going to vote for. They're not happy with what's going on. That's a block of 15% that one of these parties can go after. You should go after those right now. If I was the DA of the Freedom Front Plus, or I was Gabe McKenzie, I would, instead of talking about, jazz festivals, I would be talking to those people to bring them my standard. And then it's all the other people that aren't voting. Get them back to vote. Get in the townships, get in the leafy suburbs, get in the rural areas, get out on the farms, get wherever you need to get people to come to the polls and convince them that you can vote. Any party that does that actively is going to see a huge gain in the next election, I would argue. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Oh, I agree 100%, which is why we don't call them undecided. We're calling them free agents, because that's what they are.
Yeah, that's a better term. Yeah.
They will find themselves in a party one way or another, because we know from the modeling that led to us getting accurate results in the last election that they're likely to vote. And so they have to land somewhere. And the question is where they're going to land, and that means that there's everything to play for, and convincing them to come, move away from the ANC. And one of maybe the last thing is that I didn't mention it explicitly, but I tried to imply it, is that issues in South Africa are no longer kind of black and white. They don't break along racial lines. There's a lot more racial unity than the media would ever allow us to acknowledge. And so when it comes to finding and going after these voters, literally anyone could get them, because they could be convinced that they're not going to be convinced by racialized arguments. That's not what they're focused on. They're focused on, are you going to be able to improve my life? And if yes, no matter the color of your skin or the color of the skin of your leadership, we will come to you.
Well, anecdotally, Gabriel, that would appear to be the case. I mean, the parties that are losing support in mass numbers over the past couple of years are the parties that race hustle constantly. The African National Congress and the Economic Freedom Fighters. That's their entire raison d'etre. They keep beating that banner, that drum of racism, and white privilege, this, that, and other stuff, utter nonsense, and it's not resonating. And that's what I tell people. A lot of white South Africans watch my program. Of course, I have a very broad audience: coloreds, Indians, and even black South Africans. But a lot of the whites who watch my program are like, well, black South Africans and everything. Folks, you're not reading the room. You're not reading the room. You need to get out there and talk to people. I mean, there are a lot more Dumo Dengas and Koketsa Ratsanis and Unati Kwazas out there and Sile Ngubizas than most people realize. And it's time to realize that the narrative that the media is pressing about, black South Africans will always vote for ANC is simply false. Simply false. And now, a question before you go, Gabriel, someone just asked me, MK or somebody just a moment ago, don't I think that the ANC voters just went to the MK? Well, we could see in KZN there was a clear migration of ANC voters to MK. But by the same token, a lot of those voters had been IFP years ago. And when Zuma became deputy president, they went to the ANC. And when he became president, they went there in even larger numbers. When Zuma left the ANC, it didn't really go anywhere because they didn't have an option, but then he creates MK and they move away. But if you look at the rest of the country, the MK voters didn't bleed off the ANC. They came from other places. COPE is dead. It's gone. Forget that. That was an 8.5% party a couple elections ago. So, I mean, my point here is that it's not as obvious as what the media wants you to believe. And I think that the polls that you guys do help bear that out. So, Gabriel, I always give my guest a final chance here. I think you've kind of hit on some things that you're probably going to reiterate here. Look, there is hope for South Africa. It's not as grim as it looks, but I'll give you a chance to share. And if anything you want to talk to people about, or maybe ask a question. I mean, I know my poll. I want my next poll to ask who they're going to blame for the break in relationship with South Africa. Is it Trump or is it the ANC? You know my answer. But Gabriel, the floor is yours. Please feel free to address the audience in any way you like, and then we'll wrap up.
So yes, I mean, I'd like to first reiterate that we have been seeing the slow kind of movement away from the ANC, and the fact that the GNU has come in and that the ANC is dominating the policy agenda is not a reason to despair, because it's just driving voters further away from the party. And so as long as they continue in the populist direction, they will suffer electorally. And our data bears this out, and our data has been bearing this out for years now. And so, under those conditions, the ANC is given two major options: continue and kind of see what happens, or figure out how the hell we're going to turn this thing around. And under both of those conditions, eventually your lives will improve in South Africa. And when you look around, I'm sitting in London right now, and when I look at British politics, for example, I can't find the same reason to be hopeful. When I look at a lot of European countries, I can't find the same reason to be hopeful. And so, South Africa has struggled historically, has struggled with governance, and it continues to struggle with governance. But that doesn't mean that we will forever be like that. And I think that, I've been at doing these polls now for 2.5 years, and every time I get a poll back, I'm always shocked by how little the media knows really about the South African public. And so you must just have faith that given the public we have, the country will come right.
Well, Gabriel Makin, thank you very much for that. Appreciate that. From probably gray and overcast London. Is it sunny? I'd be shocked if it's sunny in London today. Is it sunny?
It's good. We've had a break in the gray and clouds for an hour and a half now. So
well, you've had your daily allocation, so I hope you got your vitamin C or vitamin D, whatever comes from that big ball, that big flaming ball of gas in the sky. And I'm not talking about Joe Biden; I'm talking about the sun. But thanks a lot for joining us today. Your information was very insightful, and I hope that the audience found it helpful. Folks can go look up the Social Research Foundation, the website, and find your polling information there. And I want to thank you. We'll welcome you back here. Maybe we'll talk about the results of your next poll if you're up for that, if you're keen for it, as things unfold. So thank you very much, and best of luck to you. And I really appreciate you reaching out to come on the program, because I got to be honest with you, I've been interviewing some big names lately, and this has been one of the most interesting conversations I've had. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to appear on this, and I'm so happy that you when I reached out, that you were willing to have me on. I'd definitely love to come on again when we have new results.
Okay, excellent. Well, all right, I'll let you drop off there, folks. Gabriel Makin calling in from London, a South African up there in Grey, England, sharing with us Social Research Foundation's polling data and how they determine their polls and the methodology. I think it's fascinating. And polls are always something that come in for criticism, but in this case, Gabriel paints a more optimistic picture than what we see in the media, and that when I'll be reporting today, because unfortunately I have bad news to report today, including the fact that President Trump has canceled PEPFAR for South Africa. That's going to have a devastating impact for a number of people in South Africa, and as a consequence, I think no doubt of President Ramaphosa foolishly penning an op-ed published in Foreign Policy magazine here in the United States, a major influential publication right here in the United States, and he's just poking Donald Trump in the eye. Not going to go well. And that's followed up with a News 24 story saying that Cyril is ready to negotiate. He wants to make a deal with America. Well, maybe back channel something's happening, but certainly not out in the open. All right, folks. So once again, my thanks to my guest, Gabriel Makin. It was a fascinating conversation. We'll be back with the news in about 54 minutes, so feel free to tune right back in for that. Thank you for your time. God bless. Have a good day. Be safe out there. Don't take any wooden nickels. Yeah, they don't work. They don't work in the slot machines, folks. You got to have the metal nickels. Anyway, cheers, and we'll see you shortly. Bye-bye.